The President of the United States has issued a national security command, and the highest military authority in the country has just stopped the chain of command in its tracks. Washington, District of Columbia, 8:17 in the morning Eastern Time. According to multiple confirmations inside the federal security apparatus, an internal notice from the Joint Chiefs of Staff has just circulated through senior defense channels. Its message is simple and extraordinarily rare. The Joint Chiefs are temporarily refusing to execute a national security directive issued directly by President Donald Trump. Pause there for a second. Let that land properly. In the United States military system, the chain of command is designed to move fast. And clearly, President, Secretary of Defense, combatant commanders, operational forces, orders move down, execution follows. But this morning, something interrupted that sequence. According to early confirmations coming from the office of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as several members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, the directive from the White House has not been executed immediately. Instead, the Joint Chiefs signaled a temporary refusal pending legal review. This is not the normal rhythm of American civil military procedure. Congressional leaders moved quickly after the reports surfaced. Several members warned that the situation could evolve into a federal, constitutional, and national security crisis if the dispute over authority deepens. Let me say that again so it lands clearly. A presidential national security directive exists. The military chain of command has paused its execution, and Congress is now warning about a possible constitutional rupture. Now, here is where the mechanism begins. The trigger appears to be an executive national security directive signed inside the White House earlier today. According to reports, the directive calls for the activation of an emergency domestic military mechanism. The justification reportedly invokes presidential authorities under a national emergency framework. Under ordinary procedure, that order would travel through the Secretary of Defense. From there, it would move to the Joint Chiefs and operational command structures for implementation. But this time, the chain slowed. The Joint Chiefs did not execute immediately. Instead, they signaled that the legal foundation of the directive must first be verified. And this is where the event shifts from a moment to a structural test, because what happened next is procedural. The office of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs issued a high-level internal communication. That notice made two things clear. First, the directive is undergoing evaluation for consistency with federal law and the Constitution. Second, all military units are instructed to maintain readiness status, but not deploy under the directive until further legal clarification is completed. So this is not a permanent rejection, but it is a pause inside the chain of command. And inside the United States national security structure, a pause at that level carries institutional weight. Here is where the system begins reacting. Within hours of the decision becoming known inside government channels, the Senate Armed Services Committee announced plans for an emergency consultation session. At the same time, the House Judiciary Committee began reviewing the legal basis behind the executive directive. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice has been asked to produce a formal legal opinion. And inside the Pentagon, the Office of Legal Counsel for the Department of Defense has also been activated. Notice what is happening here. The executive branch has issued a command. The military leadership has slowed implementation. Congress is initiating oversight. Federal legal authorities are being pulled in. This is the American constitutional system beginning to move, and the tension sits right at the center of presidential power. Under the Constitution, the President of the United States serves as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Military leaders are obligated to carry out lawful presidential orders. But there is a second principle operating at the same time. The armed forces also carry a duty to refuse orders that they believe violate federal law or the Constitution. Those two obligations rarely collide directly. The system is designed to avoid that exact moment. But if those principles do collide, the entire architecture of federal power begins to feel pressure. This is where you need to understand the central institutional actor here. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, and specifically the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, they are the highest-ranking military advisory body to the president. They coordinate military advice and facilitate the execution of commands through the defense structure. Their authority is not to overrule the president. But their institutional role places them directly inside the operational chain, where commands become action. And that creates the hinge point. If the Joint Chiefs ultimately determine the directive is legally sound, implementation proceeds quickly. But if they continue to withhold execution pending legal judgment, the conflict moves outward toward Congress, toward federal legal authorities, and possibly toward the courts. And that is where the situation stops looking like a political disagreement and starts looking like a systemic pressure point. Because the scale of power involved here is enormous. The presidency, the Department of Defense, the United States Congress, the federal legal system, all intersecting around a single national security directive. Add one more factor. For a moment, however temporary, the military chain of command has been interrupted. And when presidential emergency powers are involved, interruptions like that are rare. Constitutional scholars sometimes describe moments like this as stress points in the system, moments when the checks and balances mechanism is forced to operate under real pressure. Which brings us to the point that Washington is now watching very closely. A national security order has been issued. The military has paused its execution. Congress is warning of constitutional consequences. And according to several sources inside the defense establishment, the next step now depends on something far more consequential than the directive itself. Because the question moving through Washington tonight is not simply whether the order will stand. It is whether the system that must decide that question is about to test its limits. Now the procedural escalation begins. Because once a presidential national security directive collides with hesitation inside the military chain of command, the American system does not respond emotionally, it responds structurally. Step one happened inside the White House. An emergency national security directive was issued by President Donald Trump. According to reports circulating through federal channels, the order called for activating a domestic military mechanism under the justification of a national emergency authority. That single decision set the institutional machinery in motion. Step two followed immediately. The directive moved through the formal channel toward the Department of Defense. Under standard procedure, the Secretary of Defense would transmit operational guidance down through the military hierarchy. Combatant commands would receive instructions. Units would begin preparing for execution. Normally, that entire process unfolds quietly and quickly. But this time, something unusual occurred in step three. The Joint Chiefs of Staff paused the process. They did not carry out the directive immediately. Instead, they halted execution while initiating a legal review of the directive's foundation. Let that register clearly. A presidential order exists, but before implementation, the top uniformed leadership is evaluating whether the order satisfies federal law and constitutional limits. This is where the situation moves beyond routine governance. Because the moment a command pauses inside the military structure, other institutions begin moving almost automatically. Step four arrived on Capitol Hill. The Senate Armed Services Committee announced that it would begin an emergency consultation regarding the directive and the military's response. Members requested briefings from defense officials and demanded clarification about the legal basis behind the order. Simultaneously, the House Judiciary Committee began examining the constitutional framework that governs presidential emergency powers. Notice the pattern here. The White House acts, the military pauses, Congress opens oversight. And then step five activates the legal branch of the executive system. The Department of Justice has been asked to issue a formal legal opinion. Inside Washington, that matters enormously. Because when disputes over presidential authority emerge, the Department of Justice often becomes the referee of first resort. Its legal interpretation can determine whether a directive moves forward or becomes subject to institutional resistance. If that legal opinion validates, the directive pressure shifts back to the military to execute it. But if the Department of Justice raises constitutional concerns, the entire conflict expands outward. And that is where the legal architecture begins to tighten. Several constitutional mechanisms are already being invoked in internal discussions. The first is the Commander-in-Chief Clause of the Constitution. That clause places the president at the apex of the armed forces. It is the legal foundation of presidential authority to issue military orders. But it is not the only law in play. Officials are also referencing the War Powers Resolution. That statute governs the conditions under which military force may be deployed, particularly when the deployment intersects with domestic or congressional authority. Then there is the National Emergencies Act. That law defines the procedural framework through which presidents invoke emergency powers inside the United States. Taken together, those three mechanisms form the legal scaffolding around presidential emergency authority. And right now, every one of them is being examined. Here is the critical point most observers miss. As each legal evaluation progresses, the number of available options shrinks. If the Department of Justice concludes that the directive is lawful, the military chain of command will face intense pressure to carry out the order. But if the legal review determines the directive exceeds presidential authority, Congress may intervene directly through legislative or investigative mechanisms. Each institutional step closes another legal door. And the corridor through which this situation can move becomes narrower. Now, watch how the response web is forming across Washington. Inside the White House, officials are maintaining that the directive falls squarely within the president's national security powers. According to reports, administration figures argue that emergency authority gives the executive branch broad latitude when responding to perceived threats. On Capitol Hill, the reaction is different. Members of Congress are demanding full transparency regarding the legal justification behind the directive. Lawmakers from oversight committees are requesting classified briefings and legal memoranda. Meanwhile, inside the Department of Justice, legal analysts are reviewing the constitutional dimensions of the order. And inside the Pentagon, the Department of Defense has adopted a cautious operational posture. Military units remain in readiness status, but they have not moved. That detail matters more than it may appear. Because readiness without deployment signals that the defense system is waiting for a legal resolution before moving the operational machinery. This is the American checks and balances system operating in real time. The executive branch issues a command. The military evaluates the legality of execution. Congress initiates oversight. The Department of Justice produces legal interpretation. 4 institutional pillars moving simultaneously. And that is exactly where the pressure now concentrates. The constitutional boundary. 2 questions are now circulating through legal circles in Washington. First, how far can a president go in ordering domestic military action under emergency authority? Second, how long can military leadership delay execution of a presidential command while legal questions remain unresolved? Those questions do not have simple answers. Constitutional scholars often point out that direct confrontations between presidential command authority and military hesitation are extremely rare in modern American history. There are historical echoes, but there is no clear procedural roadmap for this exact situation. That absence of precedent is precisely what makes the moment volatile. Because when precedent is weak, institutions must improvise within the framework of the Constitution. And that improvisation can reveal stress fractures in the system. So here is what Washington is watching now. 3 procedural signals will determine the next phase. First, the formal legal opinion from the Department of Justice. That document could define the legality of the directive. Second, the congressional hearings now being organized on Capitol Hill. Those sessions could introduce legislative pressure into the situation. Third, the final decision inside the military chain of command regarding whether to execute the directive or maintain the pause. Each of those decisions carries consequences, and together they form a countdown inside the federal system. Because what is unfolding is no longer a dispute about one directive. It is a test of how the American constitutional structure manages a collision between presidential authority, military judgment, and congressional oversight. Washington is entering a period of institutional strain. The military chain of command is under scrutiny. Presidential emergency power is under examination. Congress is asserting its oversight role. 3 centers of authority pressing against each other at the same time. And when that happens, the system does something it was designed to do. It tests itself. Right now, that test is underway. And the United States constitutional structure, the entire balance between civilian authority, military obedience, and legislative oversight, is operating under one of the most intense stress conditions the system can experience. And now we arrive at the moment where Washington begins watching for signals. Not statements, not political reactions, signals inside the institutional machinery. Because when a presidential directive, the military chain of command, Congress, and federal legal authorities all move at the same time, the outcome rarely hinges on a single decision. It unfolds through indicators. Right now, there are 6 of them. The first indicator is the legal conclusion from the Department of Justice. That opinion matters enormously. It will not simply interpret the directive. It will determine whether the executive branch itself considers the order consistent with federal law and constitutional authority. If the Department of Justice validates the directive, the pressure immediately shifts back to the Pentagon. The military chain of command would face a clear legal signal to proceed. But if the Department of Justice raises constitutional concerns, the entire trajectory changes. Let that land properly. Because a negative legal interpretation from the Department of Justice does not automatically cancel a presidential order. But it does create the conditions for institutional resistance across multiple branches of government. The second indicator is the official reaction from the White House. If the administration doubles down on the directive and insists that presidential emergency authority is absolute in this context, the confrontation intensifies. But if the White House signals willingness to adjust or reinterpret the directive, the system may find an exit ramp. Watch that language carefully. In Washington, small changes in wording often signal large shifts in power strategy. The third indicator sits inside the Pentagon, the next move by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. If they ultimately confirm the directive as legally executable, the pause ends and the chain of command resumes its traditional function. But if the Joint Chiefs maintain the suspension pending further legal clarity, the situation moves deeper into institutional conflict. And this is where the stress level inside the system rises. The fourth indicator comes from Capitol Hill. Congress has already initiated oversight discussions. The question now is whether lawmakers escalate those efforts into formal investigations, hearings, or legislative constraints on executive authority. Once Congress begins using its full investigative power, the dispute stops being a narrow executive matter. It becomes a national constitutional debate. The fifth indicator lies with the federal courts. So far, the judiciary has not entered the situation directly. But if lawsuits or constitutional challenges emerge, federal judges could be asked to determine the limits of the directive. And when federal courts enter a conflict between presidential power and military authority, the stakes change dramatically. Now, the system moves from political and procedural disagreement into constitutional adjudication. The sixth indicator is less visible, but just as important: the level of tension inside the national security system itself. Senior defense officials, intelligence agencies, and operational commanders all operate within the same structure. If uncertainty spreads through that network, the institutional pressure increases rapidly because the national security system depends on clarity of authority. Right now, that clarity is being tested. And depending on how those six indicators move, several different paths could emerge. The first scenario is institutional de-escalation. In this path, the directive is revised. Legal language is adjusted. The Department of Justice confirms the updated framework. The military chain of command receives a clarified order. Implementation proceeds under the revised version. In other words, the system absorbs the shock and rebalances itself. This outcome has precedent in Washington. Institutions adapt, modify, and move forward. But there is a second scenario: procedural escalation. In this version, Congress expands its investigation, hearings begin, legal experts testify. The Department of Justice releases a complex opinion that leaves unresolved constitutional questions. Soon after federal lawsuits appear, now the courts begin examining the limits of presidential emergency authority. At that point, the conflict becomes slower but more profound. Every institutional step adds new layers of legal scrutiny. And then there is the third scenario: a deeper constitutional crisis. In that situation, the military chain of command remains interrupted. The executive branch insists on the directive's authority. Congress attempts to constrain it. Legal disputes multiply. The conflict spreads across branches of government. Let me pause here for a moment, because this is where the analysis moves beyond a single directive. It moves into systemic impact. First, the legal access. The central legal question becomes the scope of presidential power as commander-in-chief during a national emergency. Where that boundary lies has been debated for decades. But moments like this force the system to test that boundary in real time. Second, the national security axis. The effectiveness of the military chain of command depends on clarity and speed. If uncertainty enters that chain, even temporarily, it raises questions about operational readiness and command authority. Third, the political axis. When presidential authority and congressional oversight collide, political pressure intensifies rapidly. Lawmakers face demands from their parties, their voters, and the institutional responsibilities of Congress itself. Fourth, the electoral axis. Moments of institutional conflict often reshape public perception of government stability. Voters begin asking whether the constitutional structure is functioning as designed. And then there is the fifth axis: geopolitics. Allies and rivals watch Washington carefully during moments like this. They are not simply observing political debate. They are evaluating the stability of American command authority and institutional resilience. Which leads to the final set of questions now hovering over this moment. Where exactly does the boundary of presidential authority lie when the president acts as commander-in-chief? How much pressure can the system of checks and balances absorb before the institutions themselves begin to strain? And perhaps most important question of all, when the chain of authority inside the federal government is tested, this directly does the American constitutional system prove its strength? Or does it reveal limits that few people have truly examined before Washington is fart? Waiting for the answer. And right now, the entire federal system is moving through one of the rarest tests a constitutional structure can face.